that from a point of knowledge rather than just from chasing stories.
Right, and speaking of pushing agendas, let's move on to politics now. And official campaign period began, was it 1.5 weeks ago? And we've seen a lot of campaigns since then. And the most notable this week was a war of words between President Uhuru Kenyatta and NASA flag bearer Raila Odinga over whose promise it was first to implement free secondary education. Now, a section of Kenyans were excited about the fact that for the first time we're seeing our leaders similarly throwing words at each other that are not personally based, but issues that seemingly issue-based politics, so to speak. But Latif, in your view, is that issue-based politics, wondering whose promise it was first?
I think that's not the issue. The issue would be that whole issue of education. And I think the process of giving universal free education has been there for a long time. It's about who's going to implement it. So if one government started, the Kibaki first government started and said implement free primary, and then we started going into tertiary, into free secondary for day school, and now we're saying free secondary for all. It's something that's in the pipeline. So if one leader says, I commit myself to implementing this, and the other says, I also commit myself to implementing this, it's a good thing that, both of them are actually committing and saying we want to implement it. But remember, we always have politicians coming up with promises. So it's only that we have Uhuru and Raila promising the same thing.
Right.
But each of them always promises something.
The argument and criticism directed towards the media is that we are puppets for the politicians and you only follow what they say. So in terms of propagating that narrative and taking this free secondary education promise and running with it as an issue that politicians need to commit to, have we done that right?
I think we have actually sensationalized the story because you see, like what you said, it's a war of words between Uhuru and Raila over who's going to implement it first. Uhuru stood somewhere and said, I want to implement free secondary education. Raila stood somewhere else and said, we're going to implement free secondary education. Was a war of words.
Well, there was a war of words, so to speak. We had President Uhuru Kenyatta saying, they're stealing our agenda.
That's where the sensationalism comes in. However, the issue is, do we actually know what Uhuru's full agenda is? Do we know everything else apart from his free secondary education? Do we know Raila's full agenda apart from the free secondary education? Because those are the issues now that we'd be saying. We're interrogating what Raila has said. Okay, education, he has said, ABCD else, he has said, and this and the other. And Uhuru had said this and the other. I think that's where we should be focusing our stories on, not really on the fight.
Where does the media even draw the line then between that issue-based reporting and sensational reporting?
Actually, like Latif says, what does it take to implement free secondary education? And why did it fail? Because it was supposed to be the next agenda in the second term of Kibaki. And it's not actually a national agenda, it's an international agenda driven by the MDGs. So we know that Kenya has been lauded for being one of the countries that was able to achieve some of those MDGs. But the question is the implementation of those MDGs is what we should be asking ourselves. So now that you're promising free education, or secondary education, what is the implication? And how do you see it last? Because last election we had the whole digital agenda, and it was a lovely idea when you looked at it at face value, but the implementation of it is the question. What are the hurdles that are likely to affect that issue you're talking about? It's not just about rhetoric now. It's about added value. And again, we go back to the research era. What is the media doing to tell us more about universal education, its implementation, and how it can best achieve the goal?
Right, and even as Latif said, it's that season where promises spring up of nowhere, and very beautiful promises, that to say. But just taking these politicians into account, like NASA now says they will implement free secondary education by the 1st of September if they get into power in August 8th or August 9th. And have journalists interrogated how possible that is financially?
Yeah, budgets have already been passed, though.
Remember, when Kibaki took over government in December, he implemented free primary education in January. So it's possible. I mean, we've seen it happen before. But I see, like Koki is saying, the other issues around implementation of free secondary education are what we need to highlight. now especially that we have the experience of implementation of free primary education. What are the issues that have come up with the implementation of free primary education? We had teachers talking about, being overwhelmed, being swamped. We had the issues of facilities and classrooms and desks and teachers being employed and books being available. If we're talking about free secondary education, then let's also talk about that. What's the actual budgetary implication of this? What do we need to do? What do we need to actually know that needs to happen? How many teachers do we have in secondary education, for example, today? Walk into any newsroom, ask that question right now. Will you get an answer? In some cases, yes. In many cases, no. Those are some of the questions that we say that I think that's where we need to start thinking about research and having those hard facts behind us, so that we are able to carry on this conversation and the story.
All right. And still on the campaign trail, we've also seen, just yesterday, President Uhuru Kenyatta went to Kisii County, where he compensated victims of the post-election violence, 358 million shillings, I believe, to about 7,000 of them in the region. And this was covered by the media, of course, but it did not get significant coverage in terms of being on the front page or being the first or the third item in the news. But questions have been asked as to why now, 10 years later? Again, did we cover this with the urgency it requires?
Did the media know that there were IDPs in Kisii?
That's the first question.
That's the first question. Because, if you remember, I think there are many times that we've talked about the story of IDPs has been closed. And it was even in the era of Anwar Guru saying, now we have compensated all IDPs, we've finished the issue of IDPs now, we've moved on from that chapter of the post-election violence. And then sprouts out an issue of the Kisii IDPs and integrated IDPs. Where were they when the others were being compensated across the country? What happened? Why were they forgotten? So what has been the program since the last compensation of IDPs up until yesterday? Was it in the pipeline? Was Uhuru basically just executing what he was supposed to execute according to our time plan? Or did it just come up because I'm going there and I'm going vote hunting, therefore I need to have something for the people?
Right, and of course that compensation was a mandate of the government. When you take a look at the dailies today, the headline is Uhuru woos Kisii voters. So again, turning into a political issue or a Jubilee issue once again.
You can see where that's coming from. Because, it's been quiet for a very long time. So why now? The thing is, you're trying to insinuate the why now question. Why is it coming out now? Why are we talking about integrated IDPs in Kisii now? And now that Uhuru has gone, he says, in fact, I'm going to compensate. In fact, I've come with a check of 395 million shillings to cater for. And that's just before Charles Nessa said, we have IDPs here and you need to think about them. It's a very political play, and I think the media is right to actually bring it out, but also we need to go back and start asking those other questions.
Right, and just looking at that bigger picture, Koki, it's 10 years since the post-election violence. It's 10 years since some of those who were displaced during that time are yet to be compensated. Some say the issue has not even been addressed. And these are issues that are likely to come up even as we draw closer to the elections. So with that being said, now, what can the media prepare for ahead of the elections?
What are the stories of human injustices that keep being featured in the media? Are these some of the stories that need to be featured from a right-based perspective? Are we looking at politics or politicians' promises and the follow-up? Is it making the political class a bit cautious that next time the promises they make or what they implement basically is done so that towards the end of their electioneering period, they actually have something to show? What I've realized is that politicians, of course, map a lot of their promises on Vision 2030. Have we told the public that this document has been there and is being implemented, but those are not political promises. They're actually blueprint, the blueprint that we have used, I think, since 2000 or something like that. Yeah, so it just basically is the fact that they are able to have something to go by, but they also need to keep their eye on their agenda. If they want to be favored next time, will they have implemented things with a human rights lens? Will they have made sure that there is that human justice felt? Or is it just a matter of throwing a few tokens here and there? And of course, that will not have the right insinuation or right feeling around the issue.
Right. And so even as this campaign period continues to heat up, there's a lot of politicians. We have a lot of aspirants, about 15,000 of them. Some are yet to be cleared by the IEBC. But where does the media now draw the line as to who to give airtime to and what issues not to give airtime to? Because that's also a very important and critical role as we head to the elections. Many times we even have live events, and one speaker comes and throws in a language that nobody understands, and this is on national television. You know, just drawing from the Madaraka Day, well, only people from their community would understand. But yeah, where do we need to draw the line there?
I think then the media has to have translators, people who kind of translate, okay, just on a live note. But basically, where do we draw the line? Maybe we should have started telling the devolution story earlier. Maybe we should have gone back, maybe somewhere midway through the process, and talked about what is happening in... I know that the newspapers, and there was a roundup of what's happening in the county, but that just reminds me, like in the past we had international news roundup.
Right.
We should have just taken a bit more time to understand what is happening in Kisii, what is happening here, what are MCS doing, what is their contribution. I like the story of Baringo, was it Baringo, where everybody was thrown out, the reasons behind. Those are the things that we should have interrogated a bit earlier, and we have an opportunity to do so.
Latif.
Yeah.
Well, I think the question is where do you draw the line and who to give coverage over what? Well, if that's a candidate and they've been passed by IBC and they are vying for a position, then it's good to interrogate what their issues are and what they want to articulate. Where do you draw the line in terms of the language and what they speak about? I think it's very clear, even in the media guidelines, on what proper journalism